Hello and welcome to part 3 on the history of the modern homeschooling movement in Maine. My name is Brandy Shunk, and I'm a regional representative with Homeschoolers of Maine, and I'm also on staff with the communication department. And I'm joined today by Kathi Kearney. And Kathi has been very involved in protecting homeschool freedom, creating the homeschool law that we know today. She is on the board with Homeschoolers of Maine, and she is also a teacher of gifted and talented students. Kathi, thank you so much for joining us again today.
It's great to be here.
All right, so we have covered quite a bit in these last 2 installments, looking at the history of homeschooling in Maine, where it started, the parents who fought hard to get the freedoms that we have today, somewhat of how law has been evolving since the start. And I know you had a huge hand in that, so we'll definitely get to more of that today. But let's kind of pick up with looking at, there was a proposed bill, LD 405, brought forth in the legislature in 2001. Kathi, what can you tell us about that and kind of what happened from there?
Okay. Well, the bill didn't have any co-sponsors. The sponsor was Peter Mills, Republican Peter Mills, as a matter of fact. And what the bill would have done would have been to require homeschoolers to take the state assessment test. And in addition, it would have given local school districts part of the state subsidy money, whether the homeschoolers were using any public school resources and classes and extracurricular activities or not. There were some other requirements. There were some other things that came to light in the hearing that turned out to be an issue. I actually called the senator on several occasions to try to convince him to change certain parts of that bill or to remove the bill, and he would not, but he also could not get any co-sponsors to the bill. So what had to happen in a case like that, there were several aspects of that bill that were not really good and not in the spirit of the homeschool regulations that we had at the time either. So more than 1,000 homeschoolers showed up for the hearing.
Wow.
And it was kind of interesting because people were asking, people at the legislature and at the state house were asking, why are you all here? And people said it was a bill that affected homeschoolers. And they're like, we never see this many people at a hearing ever unless the topic is guns or abortion. Homeschoolers turned out in force, and many of them testified at the hearing. There was an accusation at that point that from the Department of Ed that people had not sent in their annual assessments. And a number of months later, it turned out that the assessments had been sent into storage, and the state really did have them.
Oops.
But it looked, but it looked at the time like they didn't. So one of the problems with using the state assessment test with homeschoolers or with students in private schools, for that matter, is that you want an achievement test to test the content that has been learned. And back before we had state assessment tests across the country, with each state coming up with a different test, how schools did that was they called major test publishers and described their curriculum and asked, does your test test this curriculum? So for some curricula, it might be the Stanford Achievement Test would do a better job of testing that school's curriculum. For others, it might have been the Iowa or the Terra Nova or the California Achievement Test. But homeschoolers are using all different curriculum. And the curriculum that's out there is not necessarily going to match the state assessment test if a curriculum, for instance, introduces certain concepts and skills at a different time than the public school curriculum does. And that happens a lot. And it happens not just to homeschoolers, but also if you go to a Montessori school, or if you go to a Waldorf school,
right,
or if you go to a classical school, things are going to be introduced at different times and in different ways. And a state assessment test isn't necessarily going to measure what is being taught.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So anyway, what happened out of all of that is the bill did not pass, but the Department of Education on its own started requiring again for homeschoolers to send in their full curriculum plan for the year in order to be approved for homeschooling.
And that was what y'all had worked so hard to get away from.
Well, actually what had happened was the department had dropped the requirement. It was always in the law, but the previous law, but the department had dropped the requirement because there were so many homeschoolers. It was like too hard to go through all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So to placate some of the concerns, they reinstituted, you had to send in your curriculum plan in order to be approved. Remember, Maine is still an approval state at this point. And that went on for about 1.5 years, and people were not happy. And, you know, there were other noises being made about changing this or that for regulations and laws for homeschooling. And at one point, after the state started requiring a full curriculum plan, I believe Homeschoolers of Maine got something like 3,000 phone calls.
Wow.
Because they were also very concerned at there being more regulation, because at that point you had a whole group of homeschoolers that had not had to submit that because the department hadn't required it for some time. And so finally, Kathi Green said, we're going to have to do something, I think. And Homeschool Legal Defense had sent us some legislation, possible legislation. And I took a look at it. And I know Maine school law pretty well. I looked at it, I'm like, no, this is not going to wash the way this is written, because it's going to conflict with some other parts of education law here in the state. So Kathi Green says, what do you want to do about it? And I said, give me that bill. I'm going to write it. I have this law and to write. And I kept some of what had been suggested. I used what I knew of Maine education law. I dealt with any of the conflicts. And it was like, you know, what I did last summer. I spent all summer writing and rewriting it. And how I had first written it was to make homeschooling analogous to private schools in Maine. At that point, we had approved private schools, which we'd always had. And we had what were called non-approved private schools, which later became called recognized for attendance purposes private schools. And they had one other acronym, and now they're called equivalent instruction private schools. And basically what it is there's a set of guidelines, but you don't have to get state approval for that kind of private school. So I had written the law initially because we had a bunch of people that were like, no, don't mess with the law. Don't rewrite it at all. There was a whole group of people across the state that were like, do not touch it. So I wrote it to be analogous to the private school situation. So you could either keep the old law and have to turn in your curriculum and do whatever else, and be an approved homeschool, or you could be like the non-approved private schools and be a non-approved homeschool, and you wouldn't have to do all that.
Got it.
So that was how it first went into the legislature to the sponsor. And that was how it lasted right through, almost through the end of the session. I had written up what would I call it? A compromise piece, because I was really sure that the legislators were going to still want to require annual assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And there were certain people in the homeschool movement that wanted to get rid of that, but I was pretty sure we're going to have to keep it. So I had that like in my back pocket already written. When it came to discussing it at the legislature, they asked Ed Green and me to come in and talk with the sponsor and with a representative from the Maine Department of Education. Hmm. And I remember so clearly the consultant from the Department of Education is like, I don't understand why we need two types of homeschooling. Because what I had put in the law would be notice of intent. So no more approval, notice of intent. But that would just be for the non-approved homeschool. Because I don't know why we need two types. Why can't we just get rid of approval entirely and just have a notice of intent? And my jaw dropped. Because I had been an expert witness in the Blount case, where the whole case surged around the idea of the State Department of Education needing approval. Mm-hmm. That was what the whole thing was about, was approval. Yeah. So my jaw dropped. I didn't say anything, but I remember Ed Green saying in his calm, nice way, well, I think we could probably agree with that. And the other piece that was really significant that went into that bill, and I remember that Scott from HSLDA and I had a long discussion about how to write it. In public schools, there is a law called FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And FERPA keeps students' records private, except from those who absolutely have a need to know. Okay, classroom teacher might have a need to know, special ed teacher might, the principal might. But you can't go blabbing about what you saw in those records. Hmm. And there's nothing analogous to FERPA for private school students, or at that time for homeschool students. And the Department of Ed had let certain people look through the assessments when this bill came up. Mm. Mm. So I decided we should write a FERPA-like, because FERPA only covers public schools, section to the new law. And in FERPA, you can't release like test scores and things like that, but there's something called directory information that schools are allowed to release unless you opt out. But they can release the child's name, their address, their phone number, their parents' names, and their birth date. That's a recipe right now for identity fraud. Mm-hmm. Back then, it wasn't quite such an issue. But if you can release directory information, then anybody would have been able to ask, where's the directory information for the homeschoolers? So we wrote this FERPA-like section to the homeschool law to protect homeschoolers' privacy, but we said that they had to opt in to any release of directory information instead of opting out. Yes. So that was, I think, really significant. And as far as I know, it's the only FERPA-like privacy component of any state homeschool law. We became a notice of intent state with a privacy section. Awesome. In that law. And we've been a notice of intent state ever since. The compromise did include keeping the annual assessment. Mm-hmm. We were told by the sponsor it's not going to pass unless the annual assessment is in there. Give me some language, she said. And I literally pulled it out of my pocket and handed it to her. She was really surprised. So there we go. And we've had the notice of intent law ever since. So it's been what, 21 years now? 21 years. And that's the way it works.
Awesome. That is fantastic. Kathi, you've done so much to just really create an environment where homeschoolers can thrive, where we can enjoy the freedoms and be able to homeschool our children in the ways that we see fit, that fit our children best in their individual situations. And on behalf of homeschoolers all across the state and for my family as well, thank you for all the attention and for using your giftings so generously to help so many.
It was quite a ride, I've got to say. A lot of my personal work in education has been with kids who, really kind of don't fit a typical school, whether it's public or private at many times. And I work with gifted and talented kids, and the usual standard curriculum in either public or private schools often doesn't meet their needs, and you have to do some other things. And some kids are so uniquely gifted or so high IQ that even with many, many adaptations, it's really hard for them to get through their schooling without some kind of major adaptations. For some kids, it might be skipping a grade. For other kids, it might be homeschooling for part of the time. And there's also special needs kids in similar situations. And I was just really concerned that there be an avenue for kids like that to be able to get the education that they need.
Yeah. And to really create that environment at your home where you're focusing on just instilling that love of learning and letting the child's creativity and curiosity lead rather than having to meet certain standards and have them perform just like, the kid next door. Really having that freedom for them to develop at their own rate and to pursue their own interests. I think that's fantastic. Yeah. Well, Kathi, something that we've touched on through all these videos, and I think it's really highlighted here with Peter Mills, is the importance of watching the legislation and of people knowing if those 1,000 homeschoolers hadn't showed up, how would that have played out differently if there hadn't been 3,000 phone calls into homeschoolers in Maine with parents saying, hey, this needs to be addressed? What would have happened? So, Homeschoolers of Maine does have a legislative watch team. And Kathi, I know you've been pivotal in being a part of that. And I just encourage people to keep note of that. Keep tabs on the Homeschoolers of Maine website. There is a legislative page where you can watch what legislative issues are coming up that Homeschoolers of Maine is saying, hey, we should watch this. And when there is action, we let you know, here's the action steps. So staying engaged in the Homeschoolers of Maine newsletter email list is a great way to stay engaged in that as well. And then just checking to the website. Kathi, are there any other tips you have on how people can stay kind of in the know and know when they need to step up and where they can take action?
Well, I would just say that this doesn't just concern homeschooling. And there's many, many, many bills that show up in the legislature on many, many different topics every single session. And if you own a business, or if you belong to a nonprofit organization, or if you are seeing something in your area that may need to be addressed, you're going to want to know what the legislature is up to. They are there to represent you, and they are there to do work. And if something is affecting you or your situation or your organization or your work in a negative way, it's up to us as citizens to let them know. If there's a good bill in there, we should support it and support the sponsor. It's part of basic citizenship.
Absolutely. And that brings to mind that we need to be building those relationships with our legislators to know who is representing us, we the people, and to be contributing to those conversations, and to keep that relationship open so that we build those bonds of trust, so that when something important does come, that the legislators are willing to listen to what we have to say. All right. Well, Kathi, again, thank you so much for all your time. To those watching, if you missed the first 2 installments, please go back and catch those. They are on the Homeschoolers of Maine YouTube page, as well as you can view the second segment, at least currently, on the Homeschoolers of Maine Protecting Freedom website. And that's also a great place to learn more about how you can get engaged, get involved with your family in protecting freedom for parental rights, as well as for homeschool freedoms. And be sure to attend your homeschool convention each year. Homeschoolers of Maine, we do offer a homeschool convention every spring, and you can register for that right on the website to begin building even more relationships with your home representatives and with other homeschoolers in your area, as well as getting equipped just on your homeschool journey. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today, and have a blessed and wonderful rest of your day.